Our perception of risk involves both objective data and our subjective interpretation of that data. In other words, we have the scientific information about the probability of something going wrong and our personal subjective interpretation of the relative importance of that danger. Well, Peter Sandman, who is one of the most well-known national risk communication consultants here in the United States, coined the definition, risk equals hazard plus outrage. Risk equals the objective data, the hazard, plus our subjective interpretation, the outrage. I sometimes say risk is equal to danger plus fear, and others use the term dread instead of outrage or fear. All of those terms get to the same point. Probably the most important point you'll take away here, that risk is all about both the objective data and our subjective interpretation of it. So recognizing these two components of risk is critical then to the effectiveness of our risk communication, because we can characterize risk communications in terms of a 2x2 table where hazard and outrage form the axes. So let's look at this table for a moment. You can see that there are 4 types of risk communication, and we call those at the lower left. We talk about public relations. We talk about outrage management. We talk about precaution advocacy, or we can talk about crisis and emergency risk communication. Let's go through them one by one. Public relations. Public relations is an appropriate form of risk communication where there's low danger and low outrage. In other words, the opportunity for harm is very low, and people's dread or fear or outrage is also very low. Now that's the ideal and most frequent form of risk communication. Now, on the other hand, there are situations in which the danger remains low, but the outrage, the fear, the dread is very high. And we call those situations, or risk communication we call in those situations, outrage management. A good case study would be irradiation of food. Now, irradiation of food has been studied more than any other food safety process that we know of. And yet the term radiation stimulates a very negative, fearful impression among many people. So there's a considerable amount of outrage and dread of irradiation, even though the danger, our scientific knowledge about the hazard of irradiation of food, suggests that the danger is very, very low. So in those situations, what we try to do is share information, respond to people's fear in such a way that their outrage is reduced. Now let's take the opposite side of this quadrant. High danger, but low outrage. Well, that's what we call precaution advocacy. And that's where the threat, this hazard that we're looking at, is in fact dangerous. But the outrage, people's dread of that issue or that hazard is very low. The classic example is cigarette smoking. Or in our world of food safety, it's the handling of raw poultry and meat, where we know that if you handle raw poultry and meat, you're at risk of cross-contamination, you're at risk of contaminating the food that you're serving or yourself, and that can cause illness. So our challenge here from a risk communicator's point of view is to increase people's concern. We want to increase people's understanding of the danger to the point that they're willing then to take actions to lower that danger. Well, the fourth quadrant we call crisis and emergency risk communication. That's high danger and high fear. So that's when people are very upset, and appropriately so, because what they're facing is a true danger, a true threat. Now, an example of that might be intentional botulinum toxin contamination, or some of the terrorists' intentional introduction of foot and mouth disease into the cattle population. The danger is high. We know that someone could introduce it and that the implications would be high. At the same time, we understand and we have to deal with people's appropriate fear, to provide them something to do to deal with their fear.